Oh, hello everyone. I wish everyone a good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us for this session, and welcome back to the fifth Africa Regulatory Conference. We have today a follow-up to our Africa Regulatory Conference that took place from the 12th to 15th of September. After that, we have had a satellite session following that in pharmacovigilance, and now we are capping the conference with a bit of a late but a very important session on the global view on the biosimilars and the updates from WHO and some of the global policies that are evolving in this direction. Before we start, I would like to quickly remind some of the rules we have during this webinar. If you can go to the next slide. So the conference language will be in English, and the participants are, unfortunately, most of our participants, they are muted, but we really would like to encourage you, and I will be reminding this throughout the session, that for you to use the Q&A. We have really, in my opinion, two of the best global experts in the field of biosimilars that drafted or were involved in the drafting of the new guidelines for the biosimilar guidelines from WHO, which was relatively recently published. So we really encourage and we really see this session in a way to also better understand from our side on what are some of the key points that you experience and some of the pain points and some of the experiences that you might have in the field of biosimilars. So when we have these two great experts, Dr. Virginia Archer and Dr. Hannah Kang with us, which I will introduce briefly, please let's take advantage of that. And also, after writing your questions, you can also like some of the questions if they were written before. So we're going to be via Anna Maria Nia and Natra and myself, Mumin. We are three of us within IFPMA Secretariat, so we're going to be following closely what you are writing on the Q&A. So please don't hesitate to engage there and lay out your questions. We're not going to be able to get all of them, but at least I will be afterwards, and we will be getting to them, and really better to understand how we can also support our regulatory networks within Africa and our stakeholders with sound regulations and with examples of what we see globally. And also in the first presentation that we're going to have from Dr. Kang, it's going to have a Mentimeter poll at the end of the presentation, which is going to be related to her explanation of the updates in WHO. And it would be great if you can participate. I mean, if you have any experience, please do answer that one as well. The slide is going to come. And just to remind again, everyone, that the conference is recorded, and the presentations and the videos will be available after this session. And if you can go to the next slide. So today our session will be roughly an hour of our two experts giving an overview of what is happening globally in the biosimilar space and the new regulations and the new trends, and really honing in to the developments and really the subtleties of the new WHO guidelines, which are very useful and updated. And also really after finalizing that with a global overview, we would like to really ask for your opinion. So any questions that throughout the presentations from our experts, anything that inspire you to ask something or reminds you of something that you were dealing with, even if it's a comment and it's not a question, please don't hesitate to put it in the Q&A, and we will be following all of them and hoping that at the end of the presentations, we can have a half an hour, 20 minutes, an engaging discussion with your questions, and we'll try to choose some of the more general ones and more easily answerable ones for our experts to answer them and continue the discussion. Next slide, please. As I mentioned at the beginning, so we have two great speakers today, and we will start with Dr. Hannah Kang from WHO, who was leading actually the development of the new WHO guidelines on biosimilars, and she was involved for a long time in WHO, and she has always been a great scientist and a great collaborator between regulators and industry representatives, and she will be giving us an update on on the surveys that they have done and the work that they have done in the biological world, and also capping with the new developments in the new guidelines. And at the end, again, as I mentioned, if you can answer her question, that would be great. We can reflect on that at the end of the talks. And following that, our WHO-oriented first presentation, our Dr. Virginia Archer, who's also the chair of biotherapeutics-related work within IFPMA, and she has been a great supporter of the development of the guidelines. She was involved very much from the beginning, and as the chair of our larger group that deals with this topic, she provides a great both historical perspective and also she's very much able to see the new trends in the field, and she's going to be giving us some overview on the developments in the biosimilar space and how the dynamic regulatory science is still moving forward in the field. So also listening to her presentation, as I mentioned, please do not hesitate to ask questions. And if you can go to the next slide. Yeah. I haven't repeated enough that the questions and answers aspects is going to be quite important. So please, again, just as a quick reminder, if anything interests you, or if you have any comments, please do let us know in the Q&A, and then we'll be following them up in the down at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I welcome you again, and I thank you for joining this session. I hope you find it useful, and I leave the floor to Dr. Hannah Kang from WHO.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to the satellite meeting. It's an honor to be here, and I would like to share some activities have done in WHO, and also like to share some issues like what's going on around the world to let you know the interest around the world. And I hope you find my talk might be useful. Can I see my slide? Thank you. Today, I would like to share some survey outcome regarding the regulatory landscape change on biosimilars conducted in 2019 and 2020, and the revised guideline adopted by WHO expert committee in April last year. Next slide. Yeah, including the survey outcome and kind of summary of key updates in revised guideline, I also want to share the outcome of International Pharmaceutical Regulator Program Biosimilar Working Group workshop held in September, because we discussed the very important and interesting issue regarding the reducing of clinical efficacy trial. So yeah, I think you may have interest, so I would like to share the outcome. And the poll question Moomin just mentioned actually related to the outcome of IPRP workshop. And lastly, I like to share the plan for implementation of WHO guideline this year and next year. Before my presentation, I would like to confess that I'm a staff member of WHO, but I'm alone responsible for the views expressed in this presentation, and they do not necessarily represent decision, policy, or view of WHO. Next slide. The first WHO guideline was issued in 2009. And in 2019, we like to celebrate like 10-year birth of WHO guidelines. So we plan to conduct a survey. The two surveys were conducted in 2019. The survey focused on the situation review. For example, the landscape change of regulation, terminologies, approval, and development of biosimilars. And the next survey was conducted in 2020, and the purpose was a little bit different. The 2020 survey was focusing on identifying the challenges, regulatory challenges, and we identified 4 major challenges on reference product, resource problem, and quality of biosimilar problem, and the other issues related to the use. For example, interchangeability, naming, or labeling of biosimilars. For survey, 21 countries were involved to cover the 6 WHO regions. Next one, please. Yeah, I don't want to let you read all busy slides, but just point out some important outcome. For the regulatory guidelines situation, as you might see from the figure, the highlighted box, the country means they have adopted the WHO guideline partially or entirely. So we can say some considerable progress made in adoption of WHO guideline. So it's clear WHO guideline has contributed to setting the regulatory framework for biosimilar in these countries and increasing regulatory convergence at the global level. And right side, you may see the table. This table to compare the terminology used for biosimilars in 2010 versus 2019. When you see the column for 2010, there are various terminology used for biosimilars, even biogeneric term used. But in 2019, we see some progress in converging on consensus use of the nomenclature biosimilars. So the term biosimilar, similar biotherapeutic products and similar biological medicinal product are used interchangeably. And the term biogeneric has not been used. So it's a good sign. Next slide, please. Regarding the landscape change on approval and development of biosimilar, we have a considerable progress. When we compare the number of approved biosimilar in 2010 versus 2019, it's huge change made. And all countries have a range of biosimilar approved in their country, and also available guidelines and adoption of regulatory approval process have been rapidly followed by approval of biosimilars. But when we try to review the plan for development of biosimilar, it's very difficult to predict. But the survey identifies something. For example, monoclonal antibodies are the dominant product class for the development, and most of blockbuster have biosimilar version at present or under development. In the past, certain global players, means large manufacturers, they dominated the market and were the major producer. But in the future, locally produced biosimilars may become the dominant product in some countries. We identify the situation, for example, in Egypt, India, Iran, Russia, and Ukraine. Next slide, please. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, the survey conducted in 2020 has different purpose. We want to identify the challenges, and based on identifying challenges, we want to plan how to help the member states in the future. And from the survey, we identify 4 main obstacles. The first one is related to the reference product. For example, it's very difficult to have sufficient number of reference product to develop the biosimilar in certain countries, and the other countries have difficulty to have some useful information related to the reference product. So we have some possible solution to these challenges. For example, exchanging information on product between NRA and accepting foreign licensed and sourced reference products, and according avoiding conducting unnecessary or duplicating a bridging study to have a foreign license reference product. This issue has been addressed, so we try to find to clarify the criteria for the bridging study to use the foreign reference products incorporated in the revised guidelines. So you may see the consideration to accept a foreign reference product in the revised guideline. And the second challenge is lack of resources. Insufficient resource of each regulatory authority is a common problem. It doesn't matter whether the country is developing or developed country. All countries have the resource problem. So to be reduced by relying on the information available from other NRA who have assessed a particular product, and also joint review or work sharing among regulators were recommended. You may heard about the reliance concept from WHO. The reliance concept is one of the solutions considering the lack of resources. But we have to remember work sharing and information sharing can be the short-term measure, not for the long-term measure. For the long-term measure, we have to provide the effort to build our own capacity, your own capacity to evaluate and assess biosimilars. Next one. The third challenge we identify is quality of biosimilars. It's an obvious problem exist in 2010, 19, and 2020 survey. You may know the biotherapeutic products which are neither originators nor biosimilars are approved in several developing nations. We try to use different terminology for such products, shouldn't call biosimilars. And for the time being, we use the non-innovative product. The inappropriate labeling of a product as biosimilar is a barrier to the uptake of biosimilars as it decreases confidence in biosimilar use. It's difficult to distinguish between biosimilars and non-innovative products which have not been produced to the requirement of WHO guidelines. Non-innovative products already approved before biosimilar regulation exists may need to be reassessed by regulatory authorities, and the terminology used for such products should not be confused by calling them biosimilars. And the last challenges are related to the use of biosimilar, interchangeability, naming, and labeling. WHO, we don't consider such issue scientific regulatory issue, but it's very important regarding the use of biosimilar. And for naming and labeling is essential for identifying the product and for the pharmacovigilance and prescribing. And good pharmacovigilance is essential for establishing the safety and efficacy of interchangeability of biosimilars. Unfortunately, there is no good consensus on meaning of interchangeability and the rule for naming and labeling. But we have to keep in mind the importance of such issues. Next one. I'd like to remind you of the WHO first and ever resolution for the biotherapeutic in 2014. Access to biotherapeutic, including biosimilars, and ensuring their quality, safety, and efficacy. One of the requests from resolution was WHO updates the 2009 the guideline for biosimilars, taking into account the technological advances for the characterization of biotherapeutics and considering national regulatory needs and capacity. To implement the resolution, particularly the part for the consideration of national regulatory needs and capacity, we conducted a survey to identify the needs and capacity. And the other request to take into account the technological advances for the characterization of biotherapeutic, we did a kind of systematic review on current scientific evidence and experience gained. Next one. Yeah, the review was coordinated in 2020, and the review include all publicly available information regarding the evidence and experience. And I would like to share some key points identified from the review. The first one was long-term safety, efficacy, and immunogenicity data of licensed biosimilars since 2006 do not raise concern. The current data could suggest that state-of-the-art analytical and functional testing and robust PK and PD studies are sufficient to demonstrate biosimilarity, where in vivo animal studies and large confirmative efficacy and safety studies are generally not needed. Based on this review, WHO 2009 guidelines have been updated. Next one. The survey result and the systematic review outcome have been published in 5 articles, so it's all open access. So whenever you have interest and want to see more detail, you may visit the journal website. Next one. Next one, please. After the all assessment of survey conducted and the systematic review, we reported all outcome to the expert committee, and they endorsed the project to revise WHO 2009 guideline in October 2020, and we just set up the drafting group member. And through 5 rounds of drafting group meeting, 2 rounds of public consultation, 1 informal consultation, and 1 WHO editorial review, the final revised guideline were submitted to the expert committee last year and finally adopted in April 2022 last year. And the final version was published in WHO technical report series. Next one. The evaluation principle for biosimilar have not been changed. So the principles are the same, but we have some key update to provide more flexibility and provide more cases and examples. And also we expand the scope of biosimilars and the guideline. In 2009, we used a similar biotherapeutic product to cover biotherapeutic product, but last year we changed the term to biosimilar to cover the biological product, of course, including biotherapeutic product. Is to align with an internationally recognized harmonized terminology and to expand to include the evaluation biological product other than biotherapeutic alone. For example, palivizumab used for infectious disease. Next one. The scope of guideline has been also expanded. So now the guideline covers biologicals and like recombinant biotherapeutics and low molecular weight heparin and recombinant analog of plasma-derived product, but vaccines and plasma-derived product are excluded from the scope of the guidelines. But there was some discussion. Vaccine, particularly the mRNA vaccine, are excluded now, but we think they may be considered in the future because it is not too difficult to characterize. Next one. Regarding the key principle for licensing, in 2009 guideline, we emphasized the stepwise approach. So we said that the development of biosimilar involves stepwise comparability exercises, starting with comparison of quality, then move non-clinical and clinical evaluation. But stepwise approach has been deleted to reflect the evolution from stepwise to tailored approach based on current practice, which show that the biosimilar development proceed in a concurrent fashion rather than in a stepwise mode. Next one. And there are three new section or subsection added in quality evaluation, and it includes international reference standard section. Now, since 2009, there have been many measurement standards we call international reference standard have been established, and we want to clarify the role and how and where to use the international reference standard for biosimilar development and evaluation. Next one. Next one. For the non-clinical evaluation, the requirement has been simplified, and the in vitro study maybe are required, but in vivo study, in rare cases, it will be required. And also, we mentioned about the 3R principle to reduce the use of animal. Next one. For clinical evaluation, it's clarified the goal of clinical studies and presented the consideration related to the amount and type of clinical data requirement for biosimilar evaluation. So articulated that the regulatory perspective about comparative safety and efficacy studies is gradually shifting from a strict inflexible requirement to a case-by-case manner, depending on the molecule and the data submitted for demonstration of biosimilarity based on the knowledge and the evidence accumulated to date. So we provide more flexibility regarding the conduct clinical efficacy trial and immunogenicity trial. Next one. Yeah, and terminology change made for the extrapolation of indication, because we found that sometimes it's confused with the extrapolation of data. So the term extrapolation of indication replaced by authorization of indications. Next one. Mentioned before, there was a workshop organized by International Pharmaceutical Regulators Program Biosimilar Working Group held in September. 5 days in total, 2 days for public access and the 3 days for the regulatory only session. I would like to share the outcome of the workshop to let you know what the issues are around the world. The public section session on 12 and 13 September. The first day to show the regulatory perspective on the clinical efficacy studies for biosimilar assessment. And the second day, which was the 13th of September, the regulatory perspectives presented. From the regulatory perspective, the regulators discussed moving on from having a default expectation of clinical efficacy studies, but noted that efficacy study may be warranted based on uncertainty. Regulators noted the difficulty of providing different advice regarding the needs for efficacy study. The efficacy study means comparability clinical efficacy study. When the question is asked, when only early analytical data are available. What they mean, the timing issue was addressed because when the biosimilar industry, they have the quality data, is not enough to decide whether there is any uncertainty or not. So the timing issue was addressed. Regulators also noted the ability to streamline in biosimilar development programs also depended on clarity about what type of framework or data could be used instead of default comparability clinical efficacy study to resolve residual uncertainties. And the next day, stakeholders, which means industry, they share their perspectives. Developers believe that comparability clinical efficacy study is less sensitive compared to the analytical data in detecting the differences, but provide it anyway because it's being expected by regulators. And global regulatory consistency and predictability is needed. And developers are confident in relying on analytical and quality data, but believe many regulators still depends on the comparability efficacy study for safety and efficacy confirmation. Streamlined duration of development is a key for developers in biosimilar space. Next slide, please. Then 3 days workshop was continued with regulators only. Before the workshop was held in September, but there was a poll in May to August. And 3 regulatory authority or regulators involved. And I would like to share some summary of observation from the poll. About 66% of responders, so all regulators, believe that law or guidance required a comparability efficacy study to support the approval of biosimilar. The common reason, 67%, for providing recommendation for comparability efficacy study were related to timing. Residual uncertainties were not known because the comparative analytical assessment was at an early stage. And the other thing I want to share, the last point, 63% of respondents expressed comfort with not having a comparability efficacy study when there is sufficient understanding experience with structural and functional correlation of analytical differences, and there is little to no residual uncertainty. Next one. And during the regulators only session, we discussed the poll result. So major respond that the CES was expected by law or guidance, and there was some discussion, and we found in most countries guidance is not legally binding, and there was no legal requirement for comparability efficacy study. That means if we have a consensus on the requirement for comparative efficacy study, it's not too difficult to implement because no legal binding. And the second one, majority responded that advice regarding comparative efficacy study was given because the company proposed it, or the question was asked at a time when not much comparative analytical data was available. So we discussed the acknowledging the timing issue, and it's ultimately this responsibility of developers to provide strong quality and analytical data in a timely manner. Of course, it's easy to say, but sometimes it's very difficult. What's the meaning of timely manner? And also there was another discussion and limited sensitivity of CES. As mentioned before, the efficacy trial is not sensitive enough compared to the analytical studies to identify differences between biosimilars and reference products. So limited sensitivity of comparative efficacy studies and limited or no example of comparative efficacy study resolving uncertainties in the analytical assessment. An overview of analytical assessment and discussion of potential risk framework. And then we are talking about a potential risk framework. And for example, when to comparability clinical efficacy study clarify uncertainties or concern versus how the efficacy study actually being used. So we try to prepare kind of like flow chart regarding the potential risk framework. But there are a lot of scenarios. So now we are trying to identify various scenarios where comparability clinical efficacy trial may be informative based on the risk. That means we have to identify risk first, and risk related to the uncertainty, product factors, or clinical factors. Next one. Before I explain this slide, maybe at the end of my presentation, you may have some chance to answer to the poll question. The poll questions are related to the discussion from IPRP workshop. So it's related to understand how much you feel the comparative clinical efficacy study are useful or not. So I would be very grateful to step forward if you could answer it as many as you can. And this is my last slide to share the plan for implementation of revised guideline. Early this year, we published an article titled WHO Guideline on Biosimilars toward improve access to safety and effective products in Annals of New York Academy of Science. The purpose of publication of this article was to facilitate the implementation of WHO guideline. So this article includes the rationale and reasons why we update certain part of the guidelines. So in usual, you couldn't find the reason why WHO revised certain part in the guideline, but from this article, you may see that we updated certain part. And the other article we just submitted to the Annals of New York Academy of Science. The article titled The Role of WHO International Reference Standard Throughout the Product Life Cycle of Biosimilars. we hope the article will be published soon, and the article include the clarification how and why you have to use the international reference standard for biosimilar development and evaluation. And now we have developed actually three case studies together with IFPMA and the other one with IGBA, International Generic Biosimilar Association. And with IFPMA, we have tried to develop the two case study on insulin, the CMC and the clamp trial. And with the IGBA, the case study for monoclonal antibodies have been under development, and we really hope we could finalize the case study by December this year. And next year, WHO will organize the implementation workshop in Eastern Mediterranean region. But some countries from African region will be invited, and the case study will be used as a training material for the workshop. Next one. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. I mean, the discussion, especially around IPRP survey and the really to get an understanding on how the regulators feel about the certain concepts within the evolving biosimilar space is extremely interesting. So as Hannah suggested, actually, it would be great if you can just use the code and answer the questions that are there that are related to what she explained earlier in her presentation on the importance of the correlations of these analytical differences, if it's enough to understand, and if we need, or at least I think that points out to the clinical efficacy studies issues. So if you have any experience, if you have any opinions, please do, as Hannah suggested, write as much as you want. And also, please, I remind you again to use the Q&A session. Hannah will be available also after Dr. Archer's talk as well. So please don't hesitate. Any questions that you might have, this would be extremely useful for us as well, for us to understand what are some of the experiences you have from your side. So I think we can just keep the Menti figure on for a minute or so, and then after that I will be giving the floor to Dr. Archer. Maybe we can go to the code for the people that did not have a chance yet to answer it. And what we will suggest is that we will be giving this code perhaps periodically down the line, and please do try to answer it now. Maybe we can keep it for a minute or so, and then we will leave the floor. I think it's working now. Well, I think there was a bit of a technical problem with the code at the beginning, but you should be able to now see the questions and answer them. And we appreciate your answers and your support. Thank you. You can also see it in the chat, where you can access the poll and where you can take part if you have missed the code. And I think throughout Ginny's talk and afterwards as well, before the Q&A session, I will highlight again the Menti if you didn't have the chance to use it yet. think we can leave the poll running in the background and perhaps leave the floor already to Virginia Archer Natra, if that's okay. We can perhaps continue with our slides and go back to the to the questions later. But in the meantime, please, if you do have any questions, do use the Q&A, or if you have any comments, please do use the Q&A. And the Mentimeter question, my colleague Anna Maria put it on the chat as well. Please do participate in that as well. I think that will be very valuable information for WHO and the work that they're doing to have an understanding of where things are on your ends. Without further ado, Jeannie, I give you the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Moomin. And just a sound check. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you well.
Thank you very much. So again, thank you so much. I want to echo what Dr. Kang said and give my great thanks to IFPMA and all the partners for coordinating us, and the honor of being able to present you all some comments today on biosimilars. And I think what you'll hear from my presentation is going to be very complementary to what Dr. Kang presented. And I want to speak to you on behalf of our group at IFPMA for Advanced Therapeutics. And I just want to really emphasize that we represent companies that both produce innovative biologics as well as biosimilars. I've had in my own career experience in both. So I have supported both biosimilars and innovative biologics. And I think it's because of that duality of experience that I really want to get a simple message across to you all today, that biosimilars themselves are a concept that is a step forward in regulatory science. And what Dr. Kang has been presenting is sort of a very clear reflection of how science moves forward. And a reminder, and this is something that for those of us who've worked in biosimilar concepts since the early days, we recognize that as these therapeutic technologies continue to advance, so must the concept of biosimilarity. It's a never-ending process. So it's really an encouragement to all to engage as soon as possible to align, because if we can align today, it really does help us streamline that process towards the future. So I want to begin by just something that Dr. Kang mentioned in passing, but I really want to emphasize it. It's about beginning with first an understanding of what we're talking about. So the biosimilar concept, it may surprise you, but we really didn't get to a definition until quite late in the process. So the very first biosimilar process discussions really were at the turn of the millennium. And even at the time, we were trying to scope out what we were including in this process. But I think you'll see now a good understanding of how we want to align on what it means to be a biosimilar. So you'll see here on this slide several definitions, some coming from an academic or a peer-reviewed publication, some from the regulators themselves. But what's at the core of it is that they should involve a comparison between the reference product and the biosimilar, such that this product, this biosimilar product, should have no clinically meaningful differences, and that we assess these in terms of both their quality characteristics, their biological characteristics in terms of activity, safety, and efficacy, and that we undertake this through a comprehensive comparability exercise. What goes in that comparability exercise is really where we see the evolution of the regulatory science. And again, just to remind us here, as I've had to many times, even within my company and with stakeholders, patients, healthcare practitioners, and government officials, and of course regulators understand this best of all, that the biosimilar isn't really a different sort of product per se. It's a biological product. What's different is the regulatory pathway by which we provide its licensure, and on that basis, how we can streamline the process for development based on what we know about the reference product. So this is really underpinning the whole process and why I wanted to start there again. But as I said, the conversations really were at the turn of the millennium, and we had it provoked the need for a first pathway, a legal pathway for biosimilars, first in the EU back in 2004. Since then, we've seen some important milestones. So first of all, I want to acknowledge the first biosimilar approval, which happened in 2006 in Europe, and this was for somatropin. At the time, again, I was working at Pfizer in that period, and it was for somatropin for genotropin, which was a Pfizer biologic. And the somatropin biosimilar was approved, and so it brought with it the regulatory science around it, in the form of the EU biosimilar overarching guidelines, and then which were also then followed by the non-clinical and clinical guidelines. And soon thereafter, I don't want to make it sound like it was only Europe. Hiding behind these milestones are many changes that Dr. Kang presented in her slides of the different countries that responded and indeed, inspired by what was going on in Europe and aligned with what was going on in Europe, started to propose their own guidances. And it was really critical that the WHO aligned and harmonized to a first similar biotherapeutic product guideline in 2009. And this was done very intentionally because we need to have a consistent scientific standard. As Dr. Kang mentioned, it's really important for developers to be able to have that predictability or producing things on a global basis, but it's also important for the patients and for the healthcare professionals to understand, does a biosimilar in this country mean the same thing as in my country? What's the difference? There really shouldn't be one. And this is really important, why we need to have consistency in approach. And this model that the WHO guidelines provided became indeed that model for the guidelines to be developed around the world. The US was actually relatively late to the party in terms of guidelines, with the first guidelines becoming formalized in 2012. And this introduced a new two-level concept, which Dr. Kang noted has created a bit of confusion. So we have a biosimilar and an interchangeable biosimilar in those FDA guidelines, which are very much a feature of how the US healthcare system is structured, but it does indeed create questions. So what does interchangeable mean? In the US, the interchangeable biosimilar additional level is necessary because it's immediately being integrated into pharmacy level substitution. In Europe, we refer to all biosimilars as being interchangeable with their reference product once they've been approved as such, and that's because they are considered therapeutic equivalents. However, in the European Union, the European Medicines Agency does not provide for substitution direction. That's a totally separate conversation, and indeed, pharmacy level substitution for biologics per se has not been advised in member states in the main, only because that is very much within a member state competence, and moreover, has certain challenges with respect to patient adherence and traceability. But that's something, again, that's an evolving piece. The first monoclonal antibody was approved in 2013 in Europe, and it was an infliximab biosimilar. And again, I'm going to call back to my old roots on this issue and say I can remember very well in 2008, 2009, when the idea of having monoclonal antibody as a biosimilar was really thought of as unlikely. And again, I'm making this point because I think we need to always be ready for the fact that this has to be a dynamic regulatory science. We are looking to a constantly advancing a scientific understanding and approach. It's not to say everything is assured for the future, but the future is not locked. So we need to understand that things may change. In 2021, we had the first interchangeable biosimilars in the US, the interchangeable insulin glargine and the interchangeable adalimumab. And most importantly, in what Dr. Kong has so very well described, the next major milestone I wanted to call out was this 2022 revised guidelines of the WHO model. And again, underscoring, because language matters, we are now referring to these as biosimilars and not similar biotherapeutic products. But that's also because it's reflecting the nature of what it's addressing, as Dr. Kong has set out, but also to reflect that regulatory science progression. So let me move on to that. I think one thing that we wanted to describe is how that process has changed. And in particular, since the first guidances came through in 2005, there have been some core scientific principles that have indeed been sustained. So not everything has changed. Dynamic regulatory science doesn't mean it's, you're constantly revising and revisiting what you know. It's more a question of evolution rather than revolution. And in evolving, what we're trying to do is elaborate and interpret with greater precision based on experience and progress. So even in Europe, we had a revision of the overarching guidelines in 2014, which revisited the definition of the biosimilar. Introduced the definition of biosimilar and revisited the scope. It allowed for, at that point, the use of an ex-EEA reference product, which had not been there before. And it also indicated, as you can see in the little graphic, a sort of a stepwise approach, where even then, it was allowable that a confirmatory clinical study may not be needed. So going back to 2014, what Dr. Kong was explaining in the recent IPRP discussions really was already in view in Europe. And it was partially because a whole process of the pathway for biosimilarities, you are trying to assess the comparability. If the first and foremost effort is around the quality studies to understand the structure-function relationship. Do you have enough analytical evidence to really confirm similarity at that point, or do you need to do more? And what more do you need to do? And this was the understanding of stepwise. But just as a bit of a forward look, please note that stepwise was really quite tight. They aren't very deep steps. So it's not a long period of time to do step one, and then a long period of time to do step two, and a long period of time to do step three. They're quite tight together. And indeed, in experience, this is what I'm going to come back to in the WHO revision. We can see that they aren't really steps. They're happening much more in parallel. And this is important to understand as we look at making things more streamlined. The Q&A guidance from the EMA that had been there in 2012 was replaced with other materials, and indeed has been also managed in WHO and FDA as Q&A. And again, you use Q&A documentation where you're really trying to make the most of current learning and experience and try and keep things a little bit more flexible for the benefit of scientific progress, developers, but also regulatory determinations. So we expected also further guidance on specific technical issues. That has been happening. Interchangeability and switching, there have been a number of publications on this case. And the FDA was at that point in time facing under BsUFA 3 commitment to do more to improve the process. And indeed, that's still underway now. That's just now still a very live topic. So we haven't had in between those milestones, nothing happening. I want to emphasize there's been a constant dialogue and continuation of the discussions as we move forward. So with that, just want to say, and a little pause, because you may ask, so in this environment of dynamic regulatory science, How have developers been responding? Well, this is just a screenshot from a publication that comes out pretty much annually now from IQVIA, which is I hope you know it. It's a supplier of analytical studies and consultancy services and data. It has been providing this analysis for the European Commission for many years. I think I was involved in the first one in 2010. So that was a long time ago. And you can just take a look at the centrally approved biosimilars, and you can see it's been really growing, not as a steady stream, but indeed in reflection of the biologics as they've been coming through and the opportunities. So you can see all the order goes from newest to oldest, from top to bottom in that little color chart at the far right of the graphic. But you can see the numbers increasing and the variety. And I think this is showing also increased competition. So I took a little screen grab from the report that follows below that explains from 2022, and this was published in December 2022. IQVIA noted that the past 5 years has been a sign of the maturation of the market. So the number of new biological molecules with the biosimilar has doubled compared to the 10 years prior. And moreover, the number of competitors within each molecular market has increased significantly. So interesting, by 2022, a total of 18 molecules now have direct biosimilar competition and have an average of 3.8 competitors authorized, led by adalimumab, which alone has 10 marketed biosimilar medicines authorized in Europe. Now, I wonder, again, in your reflection of your experience in Africa, how you might look at this, because I suspect, and I hope to be wrong in the long run, but I suspect that you don't have anywhere near these numbers registering in Africa or the competition in Africa. And I think that's something we should be thinking about in the Q&A and in the discussion. How do we get that engaging in Africa? So not all parts of the world are equally served. I think Europe is very well served. I also think that some molecules are open to competition, like you see with adalimumab, but not all will. So indeed, in particular, orphan medicines may not attract the same number of developers, or very small minor use biologics. They may also not get the same number of competitors, or indeed biosimilars at all. So we need to think about, again, as much as we think about the regulatory side and improving the streamlined development, we need to think about how we also make sustainable markets for biosimilars everywhere in the world, so that patients and indeed healthcare systems can benefit from their availability. So what was the experience that we have caused a nudge to that regulatory science to continue to grow? First of all, as I mentioned, and I wasn't very subtle about it, with stepwise development may be in theory only. What we really do see is that, you do see more parallel quality and clinical work. So the real question is, as Dr. Kang was mentioning around, when should you do a confirmatory efficacy trial? That's challenging because you're making decisions more or less at the same time. So this may explain why some companies or some developers continue to do the comparator efficacy trials, because they've kind of already banked them. They've already planned them because they weren't sure at that point in time whether they would be waived or not. It's too uncertain. And so rather than risk their launch, they decide to be conservative and go for the clinical work. There's also problems in accessing and using reference biological products consistently and globally. And you'll see this green grab there does come from the Annals of New York Academy of Sciences article that Dr. Kang is first author for. That article also cited a lack of resources, experience, and capacity, and the need to streamline for regulatory authorities to be able to work, potential for using reliance. They also noted that there were quality issues, particularly for non-innovative products. These are basically products that have been geared to act as a copy version of the reference product, but haven't gone through a biosimilar pathway. And they note that pharmacovigilance PV systems need to be effective in that regard, and as always for all biologics, but it needs, we need to be able to know what we're dealing with, what product related to what. And then going clockwise, a review of the EU biosimilar applications also suggests the limited discriminant value of confirmatory clinical studies with some exceptions. So it's interesting, the IPRP session that Dr. Kong referenced, that the European Medicines Agency, in particular the Biosimilars Working Party, may indeed be looking at further revisions to the guidance in the near future. So Dr. Kong mentioned that the revision in 2022 really was foreshadowed by this driver under the World Health Assembly and the call for the Expert Committee on Biological Standardization to review and take into account current scientific evidence and experience to update and further streamline where possible the guidances. So as Dr. Kong, I'm not going to repeat this because she's given this so well, but again, just to note that, this was always supposed to be a living document to be further developed in line with advances in scientific knowledge and experience. And so really excited to hear about the plans, especially in 2024, for workshops to share this and help everybody align and come up to speed on this progress. So you've seen this, I'm not going to go through it again, but just to say from our developers' perspective, this is what we noted, that, the focus on biosimilar now is on biological products and not just biotherapeutics, and that the reference product, the use of non-local reference products, has been made to be pragmatic and to align with the scope. There have been some notable examples of changes in the quality section, which again, we see valuable from a developer's perspective. So the use of WHO international standards and reference reagents to help calibrate assays. Because again, if you're going to put all of this focus, and rightly so, on getting the quality package right, then we need to be able to be sure that regulators globally are using the same sort of rule book and rulers to help assess how we're looking at this process. There were some considerations in establishing similarity ranges for quality comparisons and in determining similarity. And indeed, there have been pushes on what kind of specific details to include in submissions and assessments. These are tricky because it's hard to do this universally across biologics. It certainly depends on the biologic of interest, the product that you're looking at, and indeed how the developer has undertaken their work. But the number of reference product batches needed should be influenced by that criticality of the quality attributes studied and the method selected. So it's unfortunate that we can't have a simple checklist, but it's really not possible. And particularly as we look to the future, recognizing that this has to be a living document, we have to be open to how this could work, not only in terms of the challenges reflected in those products themselves, but also recognizing that our scientific ability to undertake these assessments, these analytical studies, are progressing in lockstep. So we are getting much more robust analytical assessments that we're able to apply to the future. So there's some important pieces there. Dr. Kong already mentioned the non-clinical changes, particularly on in vitro, but just to note, in vivo studies, but just to notice there's also some important advances in discussing the in vitro assessment defined for both binding and functional studies. And we've already discussed critically the piece around the confirmatory clinical studies for efficacy, but particularly there's some important guidance evolution in the details for comparative bioequivalence studies involving PK and or PD comparability. And in some cases where confirmatory PK and or PD studies may be sufficient for establishing confirmative evidence. Importantly, the safety section changes where the clinical program is limited to confirmatory PK/PD studies risk assessments may be needed to determine if you need additional safety data. So it's streamlining. I've heard some people refer to this as, the new guidance, the revisions basically cut things back and make things less, require less from developers. And I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding of the guidelines. It's not about asking developers to provide less. It's about streamlining and asking for a more precise and tailored set of data to help us make better decisions. So it's about refining our ways of asking the questions, not that we're asking fewer questions. And I hope that that's true. Everybody takes that away. If you take one thing away from this presentation today, I hope it's that we're not this is not about dumbing down. This is about tailoring and making more smarter questions about how we undertake biosimilar science. But of course, there were some other changes that maybe haven't come out yet that I want to underscore. First of all, again, a call that we need traceability, as we do with all biologics. Your biosimilar should be clearly identifiable by a unique trade name together with the INN. There's no specific INN nomenclature for biosimilars under the WHO guidances. Some parts of the world do use that or use it for all biologics. Just thinking about the US. But it still needs, you need a unique trade name together with the INN. Prescribing information in the label should be as similar as possible to the reference product, unless there's product-specific aspects to be considered. If not all indications are approved, you can just omit those sections unless there's a risk of confusion, and particularly where off-label use may be occurring. And then this is really an important one, the role and responsibility of national regulators. So the WHO guidance revision really encourages the national regulators to undertake appropriate regulatory oversight for the licensing and pharmacovigilance, which I'm sure we all can agree with. It recognizes experience and expertise in evaluating biological products as a prerequisite, and that's obviously a challenge. So we need to think about how will we, bring everybody up to speed. And then I think, and again, this is important, just so again, for patients, jumped ahead. So we can be sure that patients and healthcare professionals in the healthcare system understand what they're dealing with. We should avoid calling non-innovative biological products approved outside of these guidelines as biosimilars. That doesn't necessarily mean they're a problem. That just means that we need to be clear what we're referring to, whether it's an originator, a biosimilar, or a non-innovative biological product, that we just know what, and patients and doctors and regulators, everyone knows what they're dealing with. And there were finally some important framing changes. So I think it was really important the way the guidances have evolved. And this is certainly something that, again, was discussed in the IPRP meeting, that, we're looking about the totality of evidence. So what does all of the evidence you have that you're bringing to bear, how does it stack up? So we're not referring specifically to an overall stepwise development, but does the totality of evidence in the way it's constructed give you confidence as a regulator that you can describe this product as biosimilar to its reference and license it as such? Non-locally approved reference products can be used, but they should be licensed in a well-established regulatory framework with experience in the evaluation of biological products and post-marketing surveillance activities. And I think the WHO benchmarking program has been a very constructive way of understanding who those well-established regulatory frameworks, where do they exist? There's relatively even greater emphasis on quality and in vitro evidence as the foundation of biosimilarity. That was always true, but I think it's just a balance of proportionate discussion that's really where it's now very much grounded. I think if you haven't got the quality and in vitro evidence to really claim biosimilarity, there's nothing you're going to be able to do in the clinical space that will change that situation. So I think it's really quite a defining part of your evidence package. I think it's really notable that PK and PD studies are proposed as possibly sufficient for establishing confirmatory evidence of biosimilarity, but it really relates to that ability to isolate, really provide compelling evidence at that level. And of course, as Dr. Kang has described, that the confirmatory efficacy trial may not be necessary. But I'm going to conclude on the point that experience as a prerequisite. This is an opportunity to use greater reliance in biosimilar approval. Not only does that help where a regulator may not have experience in the first case, but it's also an important part of learning and transferring capability development and experience and sharing that together with the WHO workshops that have been so valuable in the past, and we're anxious to see them repeat now in 2024. So I think it's good understanding. What's still not included is there's still a lot of things that the national competent authorities need to take responsibility for. That's normal things such as intellectual property, terms of use. So for what extent, you have pharmacy level substitution or not? How do you manage switching? How does a healthcare professional manage switching, and how do they discuss this with the patient? And that understanding of interchangeability, and then finally labeling and prescribing information, which remain within the competence. But I want to just emphasize that the conference we're having today, I think, is part of what we mean by saying now the work really starts. So we need to make sure that training and further technical guidance is available to support national regulatory authorities to implement the guidance effectively. We're seeing already now countries adopting and revising their own biosimilar pathways to take into account these revisions. So we need to, again, make sure that that is all evolving in the right way. Otherwise, we may see some divergence. We want to make sure there's harmonization as far as possible for the benefit of all. And the WHO is really critical for this, because we need to have the basis for international alignment on regulatory decision criteria and methods. And of course, the WHO is doing this, but I really want to call out the IPRP, as Dr. Kang has, as being another route. So we don't have only the WHO, but the role for the IPRP and potentially the African Regulatory Network to be this basis for sharing experience, exchanging views, and aligning as far as possible. Because the truth is, we don't have, this isn't the end of the story, not by a long way. There is still that frontier biological development that will continue to advance. So this is again from a presentation that was last May by IQVIA, where they were talking about how we are now seeing in the, where we look at product complexity increasing. Besides orphan biologics, which I mentioned earlier, we have complex products in the future, like antibody drug conjugates and cell and gene therapies, which are still out in that outer rim, that frontier. But they're something that we can't ignore, that we will come up against. And the best way to do this is to do this together. And I will even throw in there at the top end where we have non-biological complex drugs. I'm sorry, Moomin, did you want to?
Sorry, I apologize. I thought for a second maybe we lost you, but I think it may have been my internet connection, actually.
Oh, well, don't worry. It may have been mine. But in fact, it's a great place, because I'm just about to stop. I just want to, I'm leaving this as just keeping our eyes to the horizon, and that we even have, besides our complex biologics, we also have non-biologic complex drugs, which is, again, something that IFPMA has been working on. In my own experience and looking to the future, I'm looking at macrocyclic peptides, but there are so many that we need to think about, where some of the experience of this dynamic regulatory science may be brought to bear. So with that, thank you very much. And I will turn back to you, Moomin, to help us manage if we have any questions.
Thank you, Jeanette. Fantastic presentation. Really a lot to think about from both. And thank you so much as well. And really the evolving landscape of biosimilars in general, and especially the last slide that you have does make me think where the landscape is going to be evolving as biosimilars will be always part of the relatively advanced technologies, and their manufacturing will be relatively advanced, and And I'm glad that we have people like you and Hannah that helps us guide our global policies and explains us what's happening in the field. So I would like to ask, we have roughly 9 minutes, and I would like to ask if we have any questions or from our audience, anything that piques your interest, even if you cannot get it now, we will be trying to addressing them offline afterwards. And we will be sharing these presentations, and there's going to be a summary on the topic at the end. So I hope this was a useful workshop in a way for our participants. And I want to again ask for questions if you have any, or please don't hesitate to reach out to us afterwards if it pops in your mind afterwards. In the meantime, maybe I can have a quick question to both of our panelists in a way that, Ginny, as you classified kind of these new regulatory pieces that are coming into play, and considering that a lot of misinformation that is out there, I guess your reliance point was extremely important in many ways. I was wondering, for both of you, for example, how do you reflect on the meeting on the IPRP and some of the results, and with those reflections that you have, I mean, how can you perhaps summarize where the biosimilars and the biotherapeutics regulatory space is going in general? It's going to be a bit of an abstract answer, I assume, but I think it could be very useful for us to think about it.
Hannah, do you want to go first?
I don't mind, but I would like to share the possible next step of IPRP biosimilar working group workshop, because it is the most recent event, so you may have some interest. Now we are trying to find some various scenarios when comparability clinical efficacy study may be useful for the biosimilar assessment. And then the next step, we try to make kind of mapping exercise, some scenario for needed versus not needed. Then we could have kind of criteria to provide a kind of proposal. Then we really hope we could write white paper or concept note regarding the outcome of a workshop and the further work regarding the scenario development. Over.
Very, very interesting, Hannah. Thank you so much for sharing with us. Jeannie, any last words from your side, perhaps? As you said, I think this is the beginning of a conversation, and we are hoping to reach out more with our new developments in the field, and this is I hope that will be a continuous effort from our side.
Yeah, I think Dr. Kang's comments really fill me with a lot of optimism, because again, we want to see progress. We don't want to see every part of the world trying to find its own solution. We want coordination, because that helps. For sure, it helps developers. That's no question. It helps all developers, but more importantly, it helps the patients and the healthcare professionals, because they feel a little bit more aligned when they can see that the products that are being used in Europe are coming in and being used in their own country, and it's on the same basis and as soon as possible. And that's definitely easier. We can facilitate that access where we have clearer and easier alignment between regulatory jurisdictions. And ultimately, that's the point. All of this regulatory science, all of the development we do is really pointless if the patient's not receiving it. And I think this is where I'm hopeful to hear from this, our network in Africa, to really understand what's happening on the ground. Are these products reaching anybody? And what are the real needs that we're hearing from those healthcare systems? Because I think, we can discuss this in these good global events, and we will continue to do that. But we also want to make sure that on the ground, it's got some traction and things are really happening. And so I hope, if not today, in the future, we can hear from our colleagues in the African countries to really understand what's the situation and what will make the difference most, so that patients can use these products, because, you know, it's theoretical benefit if you're not getting them. So please help us to know how we can.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jeannie, so much, and thank you again, Hannah. And as you said, I think we will be reaching out to our networks again, and we really hope that this session today was useful in outlining some of the developments from our side. And our next step now will be to individually reach out to you and try to understand what would be a global support that we can provide in the regulatory field of the biosimilars and biotherapeutics. And I thank again Dr. Racha and Dr. Khan for their expertise and guiding us through these complex networks and frameworks, and my colleagues Anna Maria and Natra, they are also running the show in the background. We really appreciate them, and we thank them for their time, and we thank you for your time, for joining, and hoping to catch up soon again.
Right.
Thanks,
Thank
Mummy.
you.
Thank you all.